On today's episode of Prodigy Pulse, we talk with Steve Dubinsky, who is not only a former NHL player, but part owner in Super Series hockey tournaments. We cover a lot of topics in this interview, so make sure you give it a listen. Let's get right into it.
So how'd you get started with Super Series?
You know what? When I retired, I kind of like was trying to do everything but hockey,
Sure.
and then it
Yeah.
kept kicking me in the face, going like, "Why are you, not doing something that's been basically your entire life?" And I went to the Minnesota Hockey Show, and I met a gentleman by the name of Dean Talifas, who ran a off-ice training center called Total Hockey. And I opened one up in Chicago at the rink that I was working out of, and did that for a few years, and then kind of moved into the tournament team world, and then into the tournaments, and then became a partner of Super Series, and then the last 10 years has been as a partner, and my job is really heavily based on recruiting the teams.
Sure. And how does that process work? Kind of where do you start with, recruiting teams? Like, how do you figure out who's the best fit?
Well, basically, looking back at it, when we first started, my hockey rankings is something that was really instrumental because everybody kind of goes off of that.
Right.
So when we built the events, we were really high end, so we were going after all of the top teams in my hockey. So it ended up being good. And then my middle son was on the Chicago Mission, who at the 2000 level, it was number one in the country for a long time. So
Right.
those were kind of easy ways to build events. And then my youngest was also on strong teams and kind of built everything off of, those, my two boys' age groups, and then kind of turned into a big business. That's how it kind of all started. Now, now we kind of, it differs a little bit because now we have events that are, elite and then kind of like mid-pack AAA. So in the wintertime and then in the springtime, we really kind of have a stranglehold on the elite tournaments.
Sure. Yeah, so you guys definitely built like a strong performance on the ice. I've never played a Super Series tournament, but I've heard of it always kind of growing up and stuff. What do you guys do off the ice? That some other tournaments might not do. Do you guys focus on any other development stuff off the ice?
No, nothing, not really. I mean, we have, we've created a partnership with the Elite Prospects, which everybody knows what Elite Prospects is.
Right.
So we've got 4 events that we do with them, 3 at the AAA level, 1 at the AA level. And, we basically have, it's a good partnership because they provide a brand that people know. And they do a really good job promoting the events. Each player that plays in those events gets a year subscription of Elite Prospects Premium, like for the stats so they do a great job on that. And then as far as like some of our other stuff, I mean, we really, social media does, a good job. We hire videographers and, we work on content. And I think that's probably the biggest change for us over the last few years, that we really recognize, how important that is.
Right.
Like for Colorado, we did the Denver event,
Mhm.
the border battle, and we had a videographer on site who was working with Prodigy Chain to provide content, and then we did the MVP. So, Prodigy Chain's been great. It gives us a really good neutral partner to
Right.
pick the teams, whereas sometimes in today's world of youth hockey, when the tournaments themselves are picking teams, sometimes it rubs people the wrong way. And I think that having, a brand like Prodigy Chain that's got the social media and the sponsorship side of it to pick the players from a non-biased perspective, has really been great for us, especially the one tournament that we've done so far.
Right.
And I know that they did something with our Exposure Cup in Boston in October as well. And we're looking forward to working with Miro and Milos and Prodigy Chain, and whoever else is involved from that perspective, because it really, like I said, it gives us that outside company that's going to, help us add a layer to what we're doing.
Right. Yeah, I know. And when I got involved with Prodigy Chain, that's something I definitely looked over. Like from your point of view, like you just said, kind of we're like that third party, like we're creating the content for everything. I mean, it's just separate from your tournament. There's no bias at all. And we're bringing, a bunch of exposure, to you, Super Series, any sponsors involved, league prospects, kind of putting them on a platform that they can, be seen by as many people as possible.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. And I like the graphics you guys use, the colors, like, it really, I think that's extremely important, and honestly, whether I agree with the effects of social media in terms of, I think there's two sides to it. I think it's a very positive, um, add-on to events. Like everybody's doing it and everybody's obviously putting a lot of time and effort into it, but sometimes it could backfire as well, because I think the social media side of the sport, I'm in hockey, so I don't know how it affects baseball and basketball and football and some of the other sports, but for hockey, I think sometimes the social media piece kind of like promotes maybe certain aspects of the game that maybe certain players can't do because it's not in their skill sets, but
Sure.
it doesn't mean that they're not valuable to the team. And the Michigan and some of these things that are pulled off, I think
Right.
I'm not even sure how many of those moves have been pulled off in the NHL this year. I think the D are a lot smarter. They've realized kind of how to stop it, maybe,
Right. Yeah.
earlier than they used to. Um,
Sure.
and it's got to be just a perfect situation. So those skill sets, which are, people really value them in terms of the, kind of like the actual skill that it takes to do it, but it also is not a real part of the game, right?
Right.
So I think that stuff's celebrated, and as it should be, because just to do it, and like, guys like Trevor Zegras and Svechnikov and some of these guys that have done it during an NHL game is just remarkable.
It's
But
right. Yeah.
but also I think it gives a false sense of to young kids that, oh, I want to be on, Sports Center, or I want to be on the, on this highlight reel. So these are the things that are important, and I don't necessarily agree with that, you know, the skating side of it and some of these other aspects of hockey, far outweigh what it is, but no one's putting a video of someone skating, you know, on back checking hard on someone and breaking
Right.
up a play, whereas the Michigan is celebrated and it's all over social media, which it should be. But I think that's probably, from my perspective, one thing that social media probably is not the best thing at is it doesn't always promote the real spirit of the game.
Right. And kind of on the same note there, kind of how do you think a player could develop in the positive direction, kind of finding different creators that are doing more training style videos? What are your thoughts on that? Like there's like just for example, off the top of my head, like I think Pavel Barber, he does more like stick handling drills and stuff like that, or like how to hockey. How do you think a player could develop with the resources they have through social media?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I think what Pavel and like Swaggy Pete and some of these guys that are doing on social media is fantastic. They're doing things that wow people, and I think at the end of the day, for those guys, they're growing the game, right? So I think from a
Right.
standpoint of from a kid's perspective, like I don't know truly if what those guys are doing is something that I think there's ways for the players to work on those skill sets, but the actual really, like the actual skill being pulled off in a game is basically the chances are zero, right?
Right.
So, but I do believe that there's a developmental piece to working on your hands and stick
Sure.
handling and using, stick handling devices. What, like there's so many different brands out there. A former teammate of mine, Jeff Shantz, is involved in a company called Edge Boss, which is out of Calgary, and they'd have a bunch of devices that are really cool and can be utilized on the ice as skills enhancement training. So I think there's kind of a separator. You've got your Pavels and your Swaggy Pete's and these guys that are doing, what I call, trick shots, so to speak.
Right.
And then you've got kind of like the challenge would be, how to work with those guys and utilize them, how to make the players stick handle better, but not, but they're not going to be able to do the put it up on the stick and make a move and do all that. But I think there's a lot of skill work which has been probably the biggest, change for me since, 2003 when I retired is,
Sure.
I tell people that I played at the highest level of the game. And if someone would have said to me, hey, guess what, in the summertime, you can improve your hand skills, I would have said, what are you talking about? I'm playing in the NHL. But
Right.
now, having gone through it with my boys and seeing how skill development and training in the summertime has really evolved, I'm a huge proponent in skill development. But I think there's a right way to skill
Right.
develop and stuff.
So from a skill development standpoint, what has changed? I know social media has rapidly changed from the time that you went through pro hockey, but from a development standpoint, what has changed the most besides social media from kids kind of from growing up young to getting older? What have you seen that's been kind of the most changed aspect through that development?
I'd say the biggest change is skills coaches, like players at young age groups, at young ages, have skills coaches, whether they train in a small group, whether they train on their own. I think that is probably the biggest change is, when I was playing in the NHL, my summers were spent in Montreal and my training was in the gym and
Mhm.
basically rat hockey. So there was a bunch of pros or college guys that we'd skate, 2 to 3 days a week, and it was all scrimmages. There was
Sure.
no there was no puck touches, there was none of that, right? So now the change is that, everyone's got a power skating coach and everybody's got a shooting coach and everybody's got a stick handling coach. And I think that's translated into where the game is at. Like the skill level of these players is off the charts. And I
Right.
think that's probably the biggest change. I think from an off ice perspective, I could also comment on how the players train, meaning in the gym, is
Sure.
way different. A lot of it now is speed and agility, and it's not, how much can you leg press and how much can you bench press and how like that's what it was when I first in college, especially, and even my first probably 2 3 years in the NHL. It was, here's your summer program, and it's basically a bodybuilder. And
Sure.
now it's really like, lean muscle and, speed and diet and, and you look at the build of, you know, Connor McDavid might be a bad example just because he's the best player in the world. But when you
Mhm.
see him in a t-shirt, you're like, this guy is the best player in the world.
Right.
But, he's 180 pounds, probably, 175 pounds, is really lean, but his speed and his skill sets are, unique. Like Nathan McKinnon,
Right.
a much larger player, meaning from the standpoint of body and, but his skating ability is off the charts. You know,
Yeah.
it's just amazing to me how some of these guys can, it doesn't surprise me that Nathan is big and strong and skates and goes through people.
Mhm.
And then you got Connor that's just this, you look at him and it's like, holy cow, like people would be like, what? Who? Right? But
Yeah.
he's figured out a way. His legs are strong, his skating, his edge work, it's just off the charts. And I think that's probably the biggest change I would say, especially since 2003 when I retired, has really been the skill of the players is just, you know
Right.
there was probably one or two players on each NHL team in 2003 that I could say have the skill sets of probably 6 to 10 players on an NHL team now.
Really?
Maybe even higher, maybe 10 to 15 players.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be probably something very common with guys that I played with. If I was to say to them, they'd be like the skill, the speed of, and some of these guys were my close friends and still are some of my close friends. But I mean, you know, there was probably 3 or 4 guys on each team who were basically there to fight.
Right.
Right. So now there's 5 in the league.
Yeah,
Right.
that
Like, and I
aspect is
have a
totally
tough time
gone.
naming, like, literally, Ryan Reeves, Tom Wilson,
Mhm.
the Olivier kid from Columbus. I mean, really, it's few and far between. And Tom Wilson's a $7 million player, so you're talking about someone who really doesn't need to fight anymore. He
Exactly.
can still play, right? So that's another change. The physicality. These kids that are coming up, there's not a lot of physical play, so they're not used to that constant grind of
Right.
being hit every time they get the puck. So
Yeah.
that's
So do
another
you
change.
think, yeah, do you think that skill, there's kind of like a balancing beam here. You think kind of skill weighed down more in our kind of the roughness, toughness kind of left the game a little bit? We kind of traded skill for toughness ish.
Yeah, it definitely has. I mean, because now, like, some of the teams, like, I'd be willing to bet that if I watch a ton of hockey, and there are certain teams that probably really don't even have a player that I would consider to be someone that really is there to fight, right? So those guys, there is guys that are very strong and like to fight, but they don't have to. And
Right.
the skill side of it is predominant, but you also look at a team like Florida, Vegas, St. Louis, like Colorado.
Mhm.
Like, to me, Vegas and Florida are built very similarly. They've built through acquisition rather than prospects, and
Sure.
they've won the last 2 Stanley Cups. And both of them are built with physical, hard nosed players. And I think the skill side of it is a little bit on the back burner as compared to some of these other teams in the league.
Sure. Yeah, that's crazy to think about. Think of a team like those two teams there. Skill doesn't always prevail. Um, it's
No,
crazy.
no, because in the playoffs, people say that in the playoffs, the top 6, that meaning the top 2 lines, pretty much negate each other. And then the teams that win the cup are like the 3rd and 4th line guys who are who outplay the 3rd and 4th line guys from the other team. And really that's really proven. Goaltending, for sure, is a game changer in the playoffs. I think that the D, pretty much a lot of the teams that have had success in the playoffs have a bunch of D that are physical, puck moving, not skilled D, so to speak. Makar, he's on another planet. But for the
Right.
most part, there hasn't been that, like, skilled D who's led a team to the Stanley Cup, as an example. It's been that solid 660 physical, you know, pounding the forwards and the other teams consistently, and that's playoff hockey, right? So I think the success of the teams that have won the cup is pretty obvious. The last probably, you know, 4 or 5 years. It's been
So how
this
yeah
trend.
how would you describe the success of the Stanley Cup teams when you were going through pro hockey? Kind of what was their style of things?
You know what? I think the one thing about playoffs is, when I really look at it, is playoff hockey, which is crazy, is the one aspect of the NHL that hasn't changed.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
If you look back, like, even I played in the playoffs with Chicago, and when I was with the Blues, I got injured, so I didn't play in the playoffs. But you know, the playoffs is a whole different almost season. As soon as the
Sure.
regular season ends, it's like the regular season gets thrown away. And, we could talk about Toronto, you know, arguably one of the most skilled teams in the league year to year to year, but yet they haven't had success in the playoffs. And every year they're like, oh, we're going to fix it. We're going to fix it. We're going to fix it. And they haven't yet. Maybe this year, I think their goaltending stronger. I think they've got some pieces with Tanev and some of these D they've got out and get. But at the end of the day, that team hasn't proven that they can take regular season success and bring it to the playoffs. So that's the biggest challenge for the team like that. Whereas, if you remember the first time I think the Kings won the cup, they were eighth and won the cup. So it's almost
Wow.
one of those things where you're like, as a coach and a GM and as an owner, you're like, just get me there because anything
Right.
can happen. Injuries, a lucky bounce here and there. If you remember last year, I think it was Boston was up 3-1 on Florida, and Brad Marchand had a breakaway. He didn't score, and I think Florida came back and won the series the next 3 games, right? So it's like that's what I'm saying. Like it's such a fine line, but I believe that some of these teams, like always at the deadline, you read about these teams picking up, a veteran third line guy who's got playoff experience, right? You're
Right.
picking up a fifth, sixth D who is physical, that can move pucks and not worried about the offensive side. So, those are trades if you look at some of these teams that have been game changers for teams that have won the cup. And this year is going to be no different. Obviously, yesterday was a big blockbuster with Rantanen going to Carolina and Taylor Hall and, Neckish and Drury going the other way. But I mean, a player like Rantanen, they've said that for years that the reason why Carolina hasn't quote unquote gone, you know, to a cup final is because they haven't had that superstar. Well, they now have that superstar. And it'll
Right.
be interesting to see if the experts are right. Like if that was the reason why they didn't move forward, did they not have that one star who, when they need a goal, he's getting it. Like
Right.
Pasternak last year against Toronto, like, you know, overtime. And it's just that's the type of player that, when, living in Chicago with the Hawks 3 cups, I mean, the first year they had, average, didn't have a superstar goalie, but their team, he made the saves he had to, and they've had surrounded with Taves and Kane and Keith and Seabrook, and the list goes on, right? But it's really an interesting game because it regular season success does not usually equate to playoff success because I think the Rangers last year won the President's Trophy and they lost in
Mm.
the first round. It hasn't
Yeah.
been so. It's just one of those sports where I don't know if 82 games. It just doesn't signify if a team is going to win in the playoffs. It hasn't proven that.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? What are your thoughts on a player or players getting traded kind of this late into the season? How much of an effect can they play with a new team going into playoffs? Can they be a full force?
Well, I think actually it's ironic because sometimes some of the trades the teams make and they give up like a first round pick and it ends up coming back to bite them because that player didn't have the impact that they expected, right?
Sure.
So but there's also trades where players go to a team and they're such an integral part of the run that like some guys, like for example Florida, so they had um I think it's Lombard, Stenland, and one other player I can't remember was made up like their fourth line.
Sure.
They all won a cup, and they all got deals with like more money than they would have gotten had they not been part of a cup winning team, right? So the success
Sure.
that they had and being part of a winning team, like, always will carry you. And that's the other thing too. Like, Stanley Cup success doesn't only mean the team itself, but it really lends itself to players getting deals from other teams who value the fact that they've won a Stanley Cup. And that's so sometimes trades are made in the summer, or free agency is guys sign in the summertime because they feel that that's going to be the reason why they have success in the playoffs, right? Or they even say sometimes when a player is injured, sometimes the best trade or like deadline acquisition is when a player comes off of LTIR. I mean, Vegas has, you know, made a they've made a mockery of the league in a sense because like Mark Stone and these guys come off of long-term IR and they're ready for the playoffs, and they can sign guys like Hurdle and some of these guys they've signed in the past where if those guys aren't on LTIR, they can't use the cap space. So, I mean, it's very interesting. You know, Tampa did it the one year with Kucherov. He was out the entire year. They go out and sign. I can't remember who they brought in, but they were able to trade for somebody that was making, you know, 5-6 million bucks, and the space was there. And then all of a sudden, Kucherov comes back for the
Yeah.
first round of the playoffs, right? So it's, you know, and I'm not saying there's any, you know, that these guys are 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 faking, or but honestly, if a player of that stature, if you need to keep him out for 2 more weeks and enable you to sign an elite player or trade for an elite player, I'm all for that because the rules are the rules, you know, and
Right.
the teams are smart enough or lucky enough to be able to do it because the player did get hurt and they're just, hey, you know what, for 2 weeks we're gonna keep you on LTIR because it affords us the opportunity to bring in other players. So I think, you know, there's definitely GMs in the league that are more savvy and do a better job, just like other everybody else. But you know, I think there's a lot of luck involved with it too.
Sure. Um, so kind of speaking of kind of recovery and stuff, coming to LTIR and stuff, you know, what did you do kind of in your off season or during the season to help keep your body at the highest end it could be?
Well, you know what I mean. Things have changed big time on that front too, right? Like, you know, you've got companies out there that are literally that sell guns and, you know, Theragun and Normatex, and, you know, teams have recovery rooms, and like, so the game has changed like that. I mean, for me it was, you know, none of that really was existed. It was merely just, you know, work out for 5 days and take the weekend off. Like, that was kind of all that was known. You know, saunas, you know, people did a little bit of sauna, some hot tubbing and different stuff like that. But I mean, today it's, you know, these kids have the whoops, you know, they have the watches that, you know, the Apple watches that
Right.
track the recovery. And, you know, these teams are basing team practices and individual player recovery based on what their body's telling them, right? So I think, I mean, it's just a whole different world. You know, you know, I don't know this personally. I just read it or hear it on TV or on the radio. But like the NHL teams, they don't practice a lot anymore. You know, it used to be we were on the ice every day for 2 hours or an hour and a half, like no matter what. Off day, every day was pregame skate, and now these players are, you know, they practice once a week maybe depending on the schedule. They don't have pregame skates anymore, right? So the game from that perspective it's just been a major you know, change in how the teams and how the players and how everybody trains. And it
Mhm.
just, you know, the world has changed. It's just a totally different animal. And you know, in 22 years it's amazing to me. And but just like anything else, you know, that's the evolution of the sport.
Yeah, and can you break down kind of your timeline of, you know, your pro hockey career? You know, kind of where did you start, and then kind of where did you end up, just so everyone's some kind of aware of your history.
Sure. So I grew up in Montreal. um I played, you know, till I was 18 at home. I studied at home. I was not by any means an elite player. um when I was 18, I decided I wanted to go play college hockey. So I sent, you know, letters to a bunch of schools. And ironically enough, one of the schools was Clarkson University, which is where I ended up playing college. But they came to watch a junior game where another player was playing,
Sure.
and the scout for Clarkson, who I still stay in touch with, ironically enough, he went back and said, this player is great. Ended up being Hugo Belanger, who played with me at Clarkson, but this Dubinsky kid is, he's pretty good. And so the coach came and they said, listen, we don't have any money for you. If you want to come and walk on at school, you
Mhm.
can. And I ended up walking on at Clarkson and made the team. And 8 months later, was drafted by the Blackhawks in the 11th round.
Wow.
And slowly over the next, you know, following year, then the year after that, and I really produced. And after my senior year, I signed an entry level contract with the Blackhawks, and I ended up making the team out of camp.
Wow.
2 games into the season, a couple of guys came back from injury. I ended up getting sent down to Indy, which was in the IHL at the time, and was down there and up and down. And for the next probably, I'd say 2 to 3 years, I was kind of an up and down player for the Blackhawks. And then one year I ended up getting sent to the minors. It was maybe my third or fourth year pro, but I was in the minors the entire year. Had a great year, had 35 goals. And in the playoffs, 3 centermen got hurt in one game. So I ended up
Wow.
getting called up to the Blackhawks to play against the Avalanche in the playoffs. And that was the start of my pretty much a 5 year straight of being in the NHL. When I was in Calgary, I blew up my knee, and so they didn't renew my contract. I re-signed with the Blackhawks and ended up in the minors again. Then got called back up, traded to like loaned to Milwaukee in the American League. I don't know if Milwaukee was in the American League, maybe the International League still. Then got traded to Nashville. Played the rest of the year in Nashville. Then signed with St. Louis for 2002, 2003. Ended up getting a concussion in December and never came back from that. So my concussion in 2002, and then I retired in 2003. So that's kind of my pretty much a brief
Wow.
synopsis of my NHL, my college and NHL career.
Wow. That's yeah, it's quite the resume. What is it? So what's it like just to like move around the NHL, like into multiple different teams? Kind of no one really talks about that. So kind of what's that process like? How does
Yeah,
that
you know
work?
what I mean. When I got traded from Chicago to Calgary, I wasn't playing in Chicago, so I think it was really a fresh start for me.
Mhm.
Um, which was great. You go there, and it was a young team, so I was a little bit older. We had a lot of really high end young players, so the team wasn't great, but we had Brian Sutter as the coach, so we were always going to outwork teams.
Mhm.
So I was there for 2 years, then re-signed with Chicago, and a lot of the same players were here, so that was an easy transition.
Sure.
Then when I got traded to Nashville, a bunch of new guys, but did have a couple of guys that played with me in Chicago at the time. And then when I signed with St. Louis, I knew a few of the guys from just other guys around the league. But you know what? It's part of the game, that you get welcomed in the room, just like, you know,
Mhm.
a new brother. And, within a short period of time, it's like you're part of the team. But it's part of the game. And I think, that's something that when you get traded for the first time, it's a little bit of a shock. But, I was 28 when I got traded for the first time. So it wasn't like I was really young. But I
Sure.
could see some of these kids, now 18, 19, 20, you're getting traded. It might be easier because most of them don't have a family. I had a family at the time. So we had to wait and move, and then everybody came. And so, a little bit different than when you're younger without a family.
Yeah, and kind of on that same note, on a smaller scale, like youth hockey wise, what are your thoughts on, you know, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids kind of moving around the country, building to play on different teams? Kind of how has that changed, and kind of what are your thoughts on, the whole building process for
Well, you know
kids?
what I mean. I think there's certain areas of the country where I think it's needed for some of these kids to go because they don't have the support system or the coaching in their areas, right? And and there is a change. You've got some academies that have built some really really strong programs, and they're recruiting kids from pretty much all over the world. Miro's son playing at Seacoast in New Hampshire. And, so that's just an example of a European player coming over here. But you know what? I think at the end of the day, I'm, I'm not convinced that it's always the right move, because sometimes these families will move their player to be in like a worse situation from the standpoint of where they are in the depth chart, but only to be on the better team. And I think there's something to be said for puck touches and getting in the right situations, rather than being a third line player on X when you could have been a first line player on Y. And you know the puck touches and the opportunities you're getting, sometimes it's not always the right move. But you know what? It's just like everything else. Parents need to make the decisions that are best for their own families, and you know, people are going to find fault with whatever you do. That's kind of what I'm convinced. So my my you know advice to families would be, if you feel that it's a better situation for your family, then I think making a decision like that is you can't listen to other people, because no matter what, people are going to think it's the right move, the wrong move. And in the end, you really only have to look out for your own family, because you know people, that's the way it just has to be, because no one else really cares about your own kid like you do.
Sure.
And if you think that moving from Chicago to Detroit, from Boston to Connecticut, from Florida to California, from California to Dallas, whatever that case may be,
Right.
because these are all realistic situations. I just hope it works out to be the best thing for the kid. And a lot of, I don't know what the percentages are, but for me, being around it and being in youth hockey as extensively as I am, I think it fails more times than in their success.
What was kind of the building situation for you kind of growing up? Was that even considered for players like you? Did you
Oh,
ever
zero.
consider moving
Zero. I
home?
mean, we were, you know, Montreal was basically like Minnesota.
Sure.
You played where you lived.
Mhm.
We didn't have AAA hockey until midget. So I grew up in Dollar des Ormeaux. We had a local team. That's where I played. And then there was a conglomerate of like double A that was like a bunch of areas that combined to make one team. So that was the only options. It was either your region team or your local team. And
Sure.
if you were good enough to play on the regional team, great. But if you weren't, you went back to your local team, and it was like double A, B, C, right? So the system hasn't changed much. It's just that now there's AAA pretty much everywhere in the continent,
Mhm.
and that's also a big change. But Minnesota's, I respect Minnesota's system. They, you play where you live, and there's no AAA, and then you go to high school, and so and they no one can argue, because Minnesota produces a ton of elite players.
Right. Yeah, I think it's so cool how Minnesota, how that's hung on for so long. No one's moving away from there. You're playing for your home
Yeah,
team.
yeah,
Crazy.
yeah. It's very interesting.
Um, so kind of going back to your college days, you mentioned like writing letters to colleges. How was that whole process compared to nowadays? Like that sounds like such an interesting process, like getting a hold of
Well,
college.
yeah.
Like,
Think about it. Yeah, like at the end of the day, like I sent them to every school, but you know, I got a
right,
couple letters back. Hey, like from Notre Dame. Hey, thanks for the letter. We'll be watching. Type thing. But I mean, at the end of the day, I got really lucky, because if Hugo Belanger had not been playing in the league I was playing at, I probably would have been. I probably would have. You know, I'm not even sure if I would have gone to American college at all. And then, there's no way I would have played in the NHL. So, nowadays there is no mistakes. Like nobody, there is no Steve Dubinsky's that people don't know about anymore.
mhm,
There's too many people, the internet, there's just, video, people get videos of themselves, the, the highlight videos, the college coaches are, you know, being told about players. There's just no, elite prospects. We talked about it earlier. There is no surprises. So
sure,
that's the biggest thing is also the fact that players, or everybody knows, like, I was born in 1970, and when I grew up, I probably knew, other than my own team, I knew like 2 other players in the province of Quebec.
Sure.
Now, like at the 2000 level, which is where my son was, at the 97 level, which was my oldest was, and then the 04 level, which was my youngest, I could have named you 300 kids at each age group. So,
Yeah.
if I know the kids like that, just because of my tournaments and camps and all that, there's no surprises.
Right. Yeah, and kind of with Prodigy changing gears a little bit, we're trying to bring light to the NIL space, like name, image, and likeness. Kind of what are your thoughts, kind of being in the youth hockey industry and kind of being on the upfront of these kids being aware of this? Kind of what are your thoughts on how kids can get paid for their name and just their
Yeah, I mean,
presence on.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a great opportunity. Hockey is, not ever going to be, what football and basketball are. I mean, I saw that the kid that left Georgia got $10 million to go to Miami to play football. NIL is going to grow, but hockey's just one of those sports that there's just never going to be enough money out there. There's not the awareness. There's not the, the amount of money that the players in football and basketball are able to generate, right? So there is, in the Big Ten schools, there are some players that are doing pretty well. But for the most part, I don't think that hockey is ever going to be big money in relation to these other sports. But I'm also hearing that some of these top CHL players who are going to be draft eligible are looking to come to the NCAA, and they're going to be making real money. If they come to the NCAA, they're going to make real money from these Big Ten schools and some schools out east. Like I heard BU and BC and some of these schools are going to be pulling up for some, if it happens, for some of these like Gavin McKenna, Porter Martone, some of these top end players that are now able to play NCAA. They're not just going to come for, the same as the 95% of the players that are in college making, just on their hockey scholarships, right? So, but you know what? It's the money's there, and if some of these schools, like North Dakota, is one that comes to mind, that they have a wealthy program, and it's going to be interesting to see over the next few years because the Big Ten schools have the budgets, and they're going to probably draw a majority of those top end CHL players who have the ability to leave.
Yeah. How do you see the CHL kind of making money, or CHL players kind of making money in that way coming over to the NCAA? You think schools are going to be coughing up a lot of money to maybe get these top guys?
I think for a player, like I mentioned, of Gavin McKenna's status or Porter Martone, that's going to be a top 2 or 3 pick this year, whatever it's going to be, or some of these other players that I've heard are looking, like let's use Matthew Schaefer, who's going to be known. Like if these kids are going to make the jump to the NCAA, which I think from a developmental perspective is a home run for them, because how many years is Gavin McKenna going to put up 150 points in the Western Hockey League, like against his peers and kids younger, whereas he can go and play. I'm just using Michigan as an example, where he can play against 23, 24-year-old men, right?
Right.
That to me, I'm a big proponent of NCAA hockey for that reason alone, is that I think that if a player can play 2-3 years in the CHL, develop, get drafted, and then maybe before he has a chance to play, to sign his entry level, he goes and plays 1 or 2 years against men in college. I think it'll be a much better preparatory cycle, call it a developmental cycle for that player, because he's now got to learn how to battle and play against much older, stronger players. And on top of that, the focus of NCAA is 3 days a week in the gym, because they only have games on the weekends. So there's a whole piece there that I believe, having gone through it myself and my 2 boys having played college, it's a huge difference in terms of the maturity level and their bodies developing. Because in juniors, they're playing 70 games. How much
Right.
time can you really put into the gym? Not as much. They have school, they have the gym, they have games, they have practice. Where NCAA, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays, they're in the gym. And each team has
Sure.
a strength coach, and they're tailor-made programs for the kids. So I'm excited. I'm excited for college hockey. I'm excited for, these kids that get a chance to play in the CHL, and then if they're not ready physically, or if the teams that drafted them, or if nobody drafted them, they get a chance to continue their runway. Whereas before this ruling, at 20 years old, they had to sign, you know, American League, East Coast League, Europe, if they didn't sign an NHL deal. Now there's 64 colleges that are out there that can give them opportunities.
Yeah, and if you're a junior league, kind of what is your process to, help kind of keep players in your standard USHL route, your NOL route? What are steps that these junior leagues are going to take to kind of keep guys to stay in their league?
I honestly, I'm worried for that. My oldest son coaches in the BCHL, and him and I have talked that any top kid who's playing in the BCHL this year, and they've lost a bunch, who is good enough to play in the Western League, or this, in the OHL, depending on where they're from, they're all going to leave because they can still maintain their college eligibility. So I think that the USHL, the NOL, the BCHL, the USPHL, the NCDC, these leagues are all probably going to take a little bit of a step back. The USHL probably the least amount, because I think that is the best league, and there's still going to be players. But
Mhm.
I believe that, NTDP is going to take a hit, which in turn, the USHL is going to take a hit and trickles down into the NOL. Like, I don't know. I think the NOL is going to become probably a strong Division III feeder. I think the bottom end of the USHL is going to probably end up being a Division III feeder because, and then look at what's going to happen this year. The portal is going to
Yeah.
it might actually be one of the largest portals, because COVID year is done. So the kids can't have an extra year that way. But all the CHL players that are going to flood into the NCAA is then going to push players down into the portal. And the portal is those players are going to push, if they're on a good program and they're good, they're going to push the programs that are kind of a little bit weaker. The bottom players on those programs are going to be pushed out. So I think it's just going to be like a feeding, it's been a feeding frenzy for 3-4 years now, maybe in the portal, but people thought, oh, the portal is going to be a lot less this year because there's no more COVID year. I don't agree with that. I think it's going to be every bit as crazy.
Yeah, and it's crazy. I think if you thought college hockey was hard to play 3 years ago, I think it just doubled overnight, which is
Yeah, and
crazy.
you know what? I'm a big proponent because a lot of my tournaments we don't have the top end kids. Like, I'm a big proponent of ACHA. Club hockey. Like, I
Mhm.
see some of these programs like Georgia building a $200 million rink, and Arizona State was a club program. Arizona is a club program, and UNLV beating Denver, which I don't know how that happened, but it did. The club hockey is a great avenue for players who still want to play competitive hockey, but just aren't good enough to play Division I. And the Division III, a lot of players don't want to make a commitment of a Division I player and play Division III, so they go play club hockey. So, and club hockey's growing. I mean, some of these schools, some of these really good, Oregon, Alabama, Oklahoma, North Carolina. I mean, the list goes on. Texas. Some of these great schools have great football programs, great schooling, and these programs have really strong club hockey teams. So, I'm a big proponent. I believe that's an area of my business that I'd like to even have more club hockey teams come to my tournaments and talk to these families about what club hockey is. That it's not a dead end. Like, your kid can still play 4 years of competitive hockey. It's just not Division I.
Right.
Or, they're all like, oh my, there's no chance, there's no chance. Well, I mean, your kid is still a good player, and just because he went to CHL doesn't mean he's going to take your kid's spot. I think that's a misconception too that I think is out there, is that every player in the CHL is better than a kid playing, you know, you know, U18 hockey as an example, right? Like, no, that's not the case. There's 67 CHL teams, I
Right.
think, or something like that. Like, not everybody's a Division One hockey player.
I think that's something that's overlooked too. I definitely overlooked that area too. It's like, yeah, they're not all Division One athletes, but
Yeah.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that forces everyone out into the portal, or who does. So it'll be
Oh
it'll
yeah,
be
it's
interesting.
gonna be, yeah. Just I know a lot of kids, and I know the teams, and I know, which kids play at what programs, and if some of these schools. I mean, we haven't heard probably a third. We've probably heard a tenth of the kids that are going to come out of the CHL. Right? Some of them are waiting.
Right.
Some of them don't want to make the announcement yet. Some of them have committed but haven't told anybody because they don't want to. You know what I mean? Like, I think it's there. I mean, every day you kind of read a few,
Yeah.
but I still think there's so many more that are going to happen, and some of these kids are going to be blindsided by it, which is unfortunate.
Kind of taking a mind off of hockey here. If you're a young athlete, what do you recommend to these kids that, they live hockey for 10, 11 months of the year? Kind of what do you recommend they do outside of hockey to kind of keep their mind off of things?
I think playing other sports. I'm not saying you have to be, playing AAA baseball or AAA soccer, but I think playing another sport is important. Minnesota, you talk about development. I mean, most of those kids will play other sports in the state of Minnesota. Um, you know,
Sure.
I just think it lends itself to athleticism, and it doesn't have to be even like you don't have to be on a team. You could golf, you could play tennis, pickleball's becoming a huge sport, right? Like, pickleball's great. You got to work on your mobility, and it's great for conditioning. And so, like, I think, the sport specialization obviously has become, kind of the way to go. But I think there's ways for these kids to enjoy life outside of, they're not robots. And that's where I think people get in trouble, is their parents put them in,
Right.
a tournament every weekend, and they're training 5 days a week, and sometimes they don't want to go, but they have to go because the fear of missing out, right? The FOMO of somebody else doing something else, and there's a lot of pressure on parents and kids today.
Yeah, I think it's a good point you bring up. I think there's a lot of pressure on, young athletes, especially with social media, seeing everyone around them. It could be a clip that a kid posted from 3 days ago that he posted today, and you think that he's there right now. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think
Social
kids
media
just
is,
never will get away from it.
yeah, yeah. It's
That's the hard
tough,
part.
and I think that the that whole piece of missing out, and somebody else doing something is a hard thing to because there is no, like, tonight, as an example, there was a kid on the Red Wings, 31 years old, who's been in the American League for 8 years or something, played his first NHL game tonight after 8 years in the American League. I mean, that's perseverance. That's not an easy thing to do, being on the buses for
Yeah.
8 years. So I think that's the biggest thing, and you hear people
Right.
and it's so cliche, but there isn't one real path. And it's true. Hockey is one of those sports where, there's other than first and second round picks, the next biggest number of players in the NHL is free agents. And free agency and second rounders are really close to each other. So, that's the biggest thing is the NHL, the draft is early, you know, the kids are picked, not all of them make it, not all of them get contracts. And then you've got these other kids who are developing later and, going to college and developing and signing as free agents. I mean, you hear about it every year.
So as kind of Super Series kind of continues to develop, do you guys have plans to kind of showcase more of a like different routes in hockey you can go down, kind of bring awareness to that at all?
You know what I mean? We kind of, especially with elite prospects, which we had talked about earlier, we bring in like, you know, junior teams to talk to the kids. We brought in College Hockey Inc. to our Pittsburgh tournament. So I mean, development is really not something that we really focus on, or even like it's not something we even promote, because at the end of the day, development to me is work on the ice and that type of stuff. To me, what we try and do is we try and give the families the best possible experience we can during a weekend. Whether it's like we said, bringing in a speaker. It's social media, it's prizing, it's MVPs, it's all tournament teams with you guys. Like that's the type of stuff that that's been probably our biggest change in the last few years, is really kind of adding on the layering what we're doing and now kind of giving a little bit extra what the parents are looking for and the kids deserve for all the hard work that they put in.
Right. I mean, it shows too. I mean, you guys grow over like 17,000 followers, I think I last saw. So I mean, that's awesome.
Yeah,
You guys
yeah,
are growing.
we're, like I said, it's that stuff's not really my forte, but I do know that I believe that putting videos and clips and pushing our tournaments and all that has become a really big, it's an important part of all of our companies and our competitors.
Mhm.
It's there's a lot of kids who play in our tournaments that have moved on, and it's nice to promote that. And it's just, yeah, like one of our tournaments, the Continental Clash, which is for young kids.
Mhm.
The first year we did that tournament, we had 51 NHL draft picks.
Wow.
So, that type of thing, right? So
Yeah.
it's really an interesting, when you look back at how many players in our tournaments play that really, get to a high level.
Mhm. So where do you see Super Series kind of going in the next 5 years with everything? Kind of where do you see you guys expanding, or kind of just overall where do you see it in the next 5 years?
I mean, I think, the game's ever changing. I think, the price of the cost of ice is higher. The fees for tournaments is going up. The fees to play hockey is going up. I don't know. I mean, I think for us, I think we're just going to, our plan is to every year kind of grow a few events, which we did this year. We added a border battle in Detroit. We added a border battle in Denver, Colorado. We've added just every year. It seems like in the springtime, I think literally we've added 9 tournaments this year. So I think that's the evolution, is kind of like figuring out where there's holes in the market and capitalizing on that. I think that's been a big thing for myself and Super Series, has been, growing, not acquiring, but growing,
Mhm.
grassroots. And, our Boston breakout tournament, when we first started, was 38 teams, and now we have 270, I think.
Jeez.
So yeah, so it's a big tournament, you know what I mean? And it's
Right.
nice, it's fun. It's, obviously it's great that we have so many loyal customers that come to multiple tournaments of ours. And I think the
Mhm.
biggest key is not changing our core values. I think if we stay with those, and teams enjoy coming, and add-ons like Prodigy Chain, and some of
Mhm.
the companies we do some work with, Goongard, and Base 360, which is a company that does neck guards. And we're trying to add those things to our tournaments, because it adds to the value of the teams coming.
Yeah, that's great. I think the grassroots route is so much more feels more like home, you know, like you're going for an experience. You're not just like a number on a sheet, you know, like you feel appreciated. Like you guys are having like videographers there, you know, you're giving away stuff, MVPs and stuff. So I think that's a very underappreciated aspect.
Yeah,
That's great.
yeah. I think, I think for the most part, pretty much everybody in our business is kind of like, realizing that stuff is extremely important. And, it's kind of like intrinsic value. Like, you're adding, it's something small, but I think it's important. You know what I mean? Like for Prodigy Chain, we could easily, for the border battle in Denver, have looked at the teams and said, oh, this kid, this kid, this kid, this kid. But it just definitely what you guys have done in terms of what the promoting and Elite Prospects does a good job too. They do like a verified player, and they're obviously the largest hockey database in the world, and that's what their job is, right? But I still think there's value when people see that, oh wow, we're going to get a year subscription of premium, and we're going to have a videographer there, and there's videos up of my kid, and we do an MVP, and like it's all these things that are extremely important to today's family, that if a kid has a good weekend, he should be recognized.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. That's I think that Super Series is like the only one that's doing that. So I love that aspect.
Yeah, and
So
for us, like I said, having obviously, Miro, like, I want him to be as big. I want Prodigy Chain to be big, but for us, like for selfish reasons,
Mhm.
I really like the fact that we were kind of first to market.